Clay Travis, great to see you again, man. I'm glad to have a long conversation. Let's start with, I think, what will be an easy question. Why is the NBA going to require unvaccinated players to be tested on a weekly basis?
I am so furious about everything related to COVID, as you well know. To me, I don't even care about any other issues that you or me or anybody else is out there. I don't understand how this midterm election is not a 100% referendum on blue state policies, blue city mayors, and just Democrat failure with COVID policies, the likes of which, I really believe this, we have not seen since the Vietnam War. And so if democracy matters, judgment matters, getting things right or wrong matter, and the fact that there are still any COVID restrictions anywhere, the fact that Novak Djokovic can't play in the U.S. Open, the fact that they're treating COVID shot people and non-COVID shot people, because I don't even use, Will, the term COVID vaccine anymore, because it's not a vaccine, right? It's a flu shot. It's a COVID shot. It might provide some limited protection. But the idea that for young, healthy people, that this is in any way still an issue that we discuss is madness. My kids are not getting the COVID shot. I haven't gotten the COVID shot. I think people certainly, I told my parents to get it early on because they're over 75. But the idea that young, healthy athletes like NBA players who are at their absolute peak of athletic physical specimens, that we're still testing them is indefensible by any metric of science or basic rudimentary knowledge.
At the highest level, the historical liars on COVID, from the Biden administration to the CDC to the NIH, at the highest level, it is now admitted that the quote-unquote vaccine does not stop transmission.
Yep.
So why then? Why? Back to the initial question, Clay, in your estimation, then why would the NBA require unvaccinated players to be tested?
Because it's not about science anymore, Will. It's about politics. It's the same reason that kids in Philadelphia have to wear masks right now. There's no logical scientific basis. It's because a lot of people decided that mask wearing made sense, and they refused to look at the data and acknowledge that they were wrong, that all of their lecturing, all of their finger wagging, all of their masking in their social media profiles, it was cosmetic theater that did nothing to make anyone safer. And if they acknowledge that, they have to acknowledge, I really think this is what it is, that those stupid red state Trump voters were right about how dumb it was to mask. And, Will, one of the things that I found, I know you spend a lot of time on the East Coast too, the thing that people are most afraid to admit is that someone who they perceive to be dumber than them might have done something more intelligent than them. And that is why right now, in the moment, people refuse to acknowledge that much of this COVID theater that we engaged in, the sit in the circle in a park, the go up and down particular walkways in a grocery store as if the direction that you were going in an aisle, they refuse to acknowledge that all of that was bunk, that it was BS. And I really believe that's where we are right now. They just won't acknowledge that people who are dumber than them were right about the way that we talked about COVID.
Okay, you said a couple of things that I think are absolutely fascinating. I want to come back to this acknowledgement or this refusal to admit that someone that they perceive to be dumber than them could have gotten something right, could have come off as smarter. But I really do think about the NBA, and I think, okay, there is no scientific backing, and at this point you have really no establishment backing as well when the CDC is saying the vaccine does not stop transmission. So I keep asking myself, then why? And I entertain these potential answers, Clay. One is liability. Maybe somehow that corporate America has convinced itself that it's reduced liability by simply going with, you're a lawyer, what would be perceived as reasonable, I guess, by a jury. In other words, if you just keep floating down the center of the stream of acceptability, maybe you inoculate yourself, not against COVID, but against liability. But I don't know anymore. I don't know what the center of the stream is when it comes to COVID. Like what the average American out there, you tweet, I tweet, and I'm always shocked at the people that say, Will, when will you stop politicizing COVID? Or Will, when will you listen to science? And I'm like, hey man, you're out here swimming without your shorts on and the tide's gone out. You don't have the backing that you did 6 months ago. You don't have Francis Collins, you don't have Rochelle Walensky on your side anymore. So why are you still wearing COVID as your virtue? You're literally out here fighting without a bulletproof vest on. And so I don't know where the center of the stream is. I don't know what common acceptability is. And so I'm thinking, okay, is the NBA and every corporation doing this because of liability? But you're offering up another alternative, which is they're pot committed to their position and they can never fold the hand.
I think that's it. I think that's what it is at this point, because if you acknowledge that there's now no COVID restrictions, which effectively I think the NFL has done, and which by and large Major League Baseball has done, but for the issue with Toronto and the fact that Canadians have lost their minds, right, which may play out in a major way still in the postseason, depending on how the Blue Jays end up finishing. Buck, Will, I think, I mean, in all seriousness, this is just refusal to acknowledge that people that you perceive as dumber than you were right. And we nailed it, right? And I think the reason why I've been comparing it to the Vietnam War recently is there are going to be, I think, a generation from now when you and I are approaching, hopefully grandfather status. I think people will look back and start to write the history of COVID. And I think guys like Alex Berenson are going to be the heroes, the people who were swimming against the stream of conventional wisdom. And I think the villains are going to be people like Dr. Fauci and Rochelle Walensky.
Your projection of the future, though, relies on this concept that the long arc of history bends towards the truth. And I'm not sure if I can sign up for that just yet, because history is written by the victors. Right?
I'm a history major, and I like to believe that over time we get things right, and sometimes the passions of the moment cloud our ability to see things clearly. That's what history teaches us. But to your point, if history is going to become a straight political dogma, which is certainly what the 1619 Project is, right? It's not telling the history of 1619. It's telling the history of America in a way that obviates any sort of American exceptionalism or argues that we are in any way a force for good. If that is still going to be ascendant in 20 years, maybe the true history will not be written of COVID. I tend to believe that the data is so clear, so readily transparent, and so easily accessible that it will be impossible to argue that the Faucis of the world, the Cuomos before he was deposed, the Gavin Newsoms of the world, the blue state city and governors. Look, Buck, I keep saying Buck because these are conversations that we have every day. But all you have to do is look at the overall school issue. Look, we lost millions of kids who just disappeared. Overwhelmingly, those kids are Black and Hispanic. I was a public school kid for K through 12. We didn't have computers at home. It wasn't like I was struggling, but comparatively, we were very middle of the road. We were the definition of middle class family. These are the kids that got lost and left behind. And it's fascinating to me that we talk about the right and wrong side of history, and Democrats are obsessed now with equity, not equality. This is the least equitable thing that anybody has done in our lifetimes, was tell these poor kids, hey, you're going to go remote learn. And we lost, I think, millions of kids that would have otherwise been in school. It's why I fought so hard for sports. I mean, Will, think about how many kids you knew who only came to school because they were on a team. And think about how many kids all over the country, because they didn't have access to a coach, they didn't have access to a team, just frittered off into middle of nowhere because they didn't have that security, they didn't have that structure in their lives. You probably hear it in my voice. I'm still furious about this. Last year, I went and argued against masks. I'm still as passionate and fired up about this as I have been on any issue, frankly, in my life. We got it wrong. It's a failure of American policy.
So, there is a saying, and it's a little bit like what you're talking about. The long arc of history bends towards the truth. There's a saying of you don't want to end up on the wrong side of history. But I'm a believer that history is written by the victors. And that's why it makes the current fight, the one that you're engaged in so passionately, so important to fight for the truth, because that will be who writes the history. Now, I'm going to forgive you for calling me Buck because you spend 3 hours a day talking to Buck Sexton on the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton show. And I'm flattered to be
just like this, where I'm looking at him in the iPad. So it is literally the exact same thing I do, except I don't have the mic in front of me right now.
I saw Buck this past weekend, and he told me you guys use FaceTime to communicate behind the scenes during the show. But I want to follow up on this idea for a moment about there's a certain segment of people that don't want to admit they were wrong to people that they think are inferior, the people that they think are dumb. So I've become personally passionate about this concept of elitism. And I think it is not clear when we talk about the role of elitists in American culture. So let me paint it to you this way. Look, you might have grown up middle class, Clay, but you are wealthy. In fact, you brag about your wealth on many occasions. You've talked about your mansion or your getaway home, your vacations in Florida, which I'm smiling as I talk to you. I am well off. I am in the small percentages of American success. I don't say that as a way to brag. I say it as a source of honesty about where I'm coming from in this conversation. By traditional metrics of wealth, we would be elite. But I don't think either of us would be considered elite, even among the elite, and therefore not elite when it comes to those who are distinguishing themselves from the common man and making so many decisions based upon being better than someone else. I think that what you described is a certain, and it is not exclusively, but it is predominantly on the left, a certain segment of people who define every decision-making matrix in their life, Clay, based upon how can I be better than someone else. Maybe it's a small town person who grew up and went to Manhattan and got more quote unquote educated. Maybe it's wealth. Maybe it's sitting in the right pew at church. But I think elitism elitism is the core component of American society. What do you think, and how do you define elitism?
So I believe that being elite is something to be aspired to. Sports determines what being elite is. I've always aspired to talk and write for the largest possible audience. I remember having this sort of thought process when I was in school. Do I want to become a history PhD? Because I was a history major. I loved it. I legitimately thought about it. And the more I studied history PhD, I was like, I don't want to spend the rest of my life writing, not that there's anything wrong about this, about the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. I might want to read the book about the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, but I don't want to focus and become, the same thing with the law, which I'm sure you saw too. People become experts in a tiny segment of the larger universe, and that expertise takes you out of seeing the big picture. I've always been kind of a big picture guy, a big story guy. The things that I gravitate to are, movies that appeal to people who are 6-year-old and also 80, right? We could probably sit around and talk about why the 80s and 90s did that so well and what niche culture has created since then, right? I like Game of Thrones. I like going to fast food restaurants. I tend to like the things that most people like. I'm going to college football games. That ain't an elite crowd. Now, there are elite people in terms of wealth that go there, but you're going to have a beer, you're going to kick your feet up, and you're going to watch a game. So I think there's a segment of the population that is not having tremendous amounts of success, but they define themselves based on where they went to college, maybe where they went to high school, by the people that they surround themselves with. And they like to look down on others who they don't believe are as accomplished as they are. And that means that you and I can be successful in life, but we go on Fox News, we talk to the unwashed masses on radio. We can never be that elite East Coast mentality or West Coast mentality. I think there are a lot of people who look down on us. And what those people put their value in is they may not have the audience that we do. They may not have the measurable success in terms of media that we do, but they want to believe that they are a lot smarter than us. And when their intelligence is questioned, and when they are exposed as having been wrong on an intellectual issue, they cannot handle it. And so they cling ever more fervently to the idea that we are actually wrong, even as all the data and analysis surrounds them. Let me just say this. Every day I wake up and think, am I wrong about this issue? I challenge myself because I think that's what an intellectual, like, you should be battling in your brain every day against the other side's argument. I think that's what good lawyers do. And I know both you and I do not practice full-time anymore. But I think there's a willful blindness in much of our culture where you do not challenge yourself every single day. And if you don't challenge yourself, I think your ability to see the larger picture vanishes. And I think that's where we are. A lot of people in their silos, and they're so concerned about making sure that they're well-liked in that silo.
Not only do we share a legal education, our love of sports, but we share a love of history. I'm curious, do you have one period, either in world history or American history, where you always buy the book, that you loved studying, that you love watching movies about? Is there one period in history that is your favorite? What is it?
With the Civil War. I basically live on a Civil War battlefield now. I would put myself in the 99.9 percentile of knowledge about the Civil War. Like, I know way more about the Civil War than I do college football, relative probably to the larger marketplace. Now, I'm still way up there in college football and the NFL and everything else. But if you told me my life was on the line and I was going to have to go head to head against, like, it was like a Hunger Games for Civil War knowledge, I would go a long time till I would die. I'll just put it out there. Not to brag or draw attention to myself. I hate to do both those things, but I would kick the crap out of most people on Civil War history.
Do you know what I love about that answer? And I'm going to give you mine as another example or illustration of this observation. I love provincialism. I love people loving where they're from. I love accents. I love local history. You know, your partner on radio, Buck Sexton, I don't know what his answer would be to that question, but it wouldn't surprise me if he said the Revolutionary War period. People from the Northeast.
His answer would actually be like 15th century, you know, like the Crusades or something. Like, I think he would even be more dirty than us. It wouldn't be American history, I don't think.
Well, mine would be the 1800s and American frontier history. I like anything on the edge. I like anything on the edge. So I love the Texas Indian Wars.
Smart guy, like their exploration, like you would be like all in on that.
I've read Undaunted Courage, but even more provincially, I want the Southern Plains. I read about Comanches and the Texas Rangers and those wars. Yeah. And to extend the idea that I love things on the edge, I love reading about explorers, Antarctic and Arctic explorers. I love anything where there was a man pressed against the elements, be they violent death or just freezing or dehydrating, dying out on the elements of the frontier. I love that man facing that challenge and pushing civilization further and pushing himself. I'm attracted to that over and over and over again. Now I'm reading one about Kit Carson.
Yeah. I just read a great book. I mean, you'd probably love it. I can't remember the name of it, about Daniel Boone and the settlements, like his exploration history. As a kid growing up, I was a monster Davy Crockett fan. So it's funny to think back now, but for my 6th birthday, my dad took me to the Alamo. And he was like, you and I are going to go on a trip. Where you want to go? I want to go to San Antonio. I want to go to the Alamo. So I was on the tour of the Alamo, and it's fun now because you've got kids, I've got kids. I can think back on it. I knew the answer to every question that the tour guides were asking as a 6-year-old. It didn't seem abnormal to me at the time. Now I go back and think, like, that was super weird to be a 6-year-old and know everything there was to know about the Alamo. But that's the kind of kid that I was. I was obsessed with American history even at that age, and that was my dream, was to, like, get to go to the Alamo.
But that's not weird to me. There's a comedian that's going around somewhat virally right now where he's asking and making fun of the idea that Tennessee's nickname is the Volunteers. Like, what does that mean? I know exactly what that means. In part, it means volunteering for the Texas Revolution. The two states are intertwined. If we took a broad view of my studio right here, right now, I've got the Gonzales flag, the Come and Take It flag, the 1824 Alamo flag, and right over here I've got the Tennessee flag. The Tennessee-Texas connection is deep because it was Tennesseans like Davy Crockett that fought at the Alamo.
Yeah, and also the volunteer aspect has to do with the War of 1812, too. I don't want somebody to history nerd us and be like, well, actually, So
I said in part. I did say in part.
Yeah, like the Alamo, the historic, and I think what that does, to your point on the things that you love studying, it contextualizes that what we're dealing with today is not actually the worst ever, right? Everything on social media, people are convinced that this is the worst time ever. I'm like, wait, we had a presidential election during the Civil War, right? We had a presidential election during World War II. Like, whatever happens in 2024, I'm hopeful we're not going to actually be in the middle of a world war or a war that's taking place inside of the country. I think we're probably going to be fine. And that's what history teaches you if you look at it. And now, longer lens, you might be like, well, ancient Rome fell apart and things do fall apart. But at least in American history, we have not had, I do not believe we are at the breaking points where we have been historically in the past.
I don't know if I agree with that completely. It's an optimism that I admire. I do think there is a general sense of the decline of civilization in our culture. There's a lot of perversions that we're indulging now that are the type of perversions you indulge when you have nothing left to fight for, when you have nothing left to aspire to.
Like, you can draw an analogy to ancient Rome that we're in the bread and circuses phase of the American decline.
Yes.
I hope that's not true, and I tend to be a super optimist in general. I mean, you talked about I wake up every morning, and for a couple of minutes, I just lay in bed and think about all the things that I'm grateful for, right? Before I grab my phone, literally just 2 minutes. And I think it centers your worldview in a way that sometimes when you're in the middle of the day-to-day fight, you're checking your Twitter feed, you're watching to see what the headlines are for the day. It can feel like there's a great weight on your shoulders. And I mean, maybe I'm weird. Like, I still, like, every now and then when I'm like brushing my teeth, I'll stand there and I'll think, man, it's really amazing that we have running water, right? Like, I mean, there are so many things, air conditioning, when it's 90 degrees outside, I'll be like, man, this is real. Maybe I'm super old fashioned in that way. But but people don't know this. Before we came on, I'm not super tech knowledgeable. Like, I don't know how to do anything, which is ironic because I got, Outkick, which is obviously doing well on the internet. But like, things that aren't that impressive to most people are super impressive still to me. And I don't know why that is, but I'm still things that I have the limited knowledge of, like how in the world do we manage to have running water all over the world and electricity and everything else? I'm like, this is kind of cool, right? And it still kind of impresses me.
Oh, I do know that about you, that you're an optimist. I want to ping pong. I want to come back in just a moment to political issues in the midterm elections. But while we're sort of here taking every fork in the road, in a week and a half, Clay, I will be in Austin. I will be at Texas, Alabama. You will be there too.
Yeah,
okay,
Buck's
good.
With me too. Speaking of Buck earlier, we're gonna be down doing our radio show Thursday, Friday, and then I'll be doing some big noon stuff for the Texas Alabama game.
Excellent. I'll be doing Fox and Friends on Saturday morning from Texas, Alabama, and I'm
probably doing it with you. I'll probably be doing something with you there. So anyway, before they may not
Excellent.
even know that yet, but yes.
And I will be at the game for a while, at least, before I have to fly back to New York. I'm a homer, and everyone knows that about anything I choose to be a homer. But even I know this is going to get ugly. I think this is going to be very, very ugly. Do you see any surprises in Texas, Alabama?
I mean, I think the surprises can be no, I think Alabama is going to win comfortably. But I do think that that Alabama is, unfortunately for you, playing in a we're disrespected based on the fact that we didn't win the national championship last year. And so I think the defense might give up some big plays to Sark, who has been going against this Alabama-style defense for years. And I think early he may be able to scheme a couple of advantageous plays. So it wouldn't shock me if Texas in the first half because sometimes you have to be able to hit Saban with a big play because you're not going to consistently, typically, go down the field against him. It wouldn't shock me if Texas hit a couple of big plays early, but then I think you get the leaning on them, and I think by the third and the fourth quarter, Alabama's pulling away and winning by, two or three touchdowns pretty comfortably. It's not particularly in doubt. I haven't even looked. What's the look-ahead line,
I don't know what the look headline is, and I think actually 2 touchdowns would be a real victory for Texas. Their only wild card, the only potential surprise.
17 or 20 or something like that.
That sounds about right. And I think the only real surprise will be Texas's quarterback, Quinn Ewers. And we don't know which way that will go because we haven't seen him play in like 2 years. But he was the all-world recruit 2 years ago. And he's got an amazing arm and amazing talent. And if he just comes out, and he hasn't been necessarily doing this in practice and in the spring, but if he just comes out and it's like, oh, my God, we just found the next Andrew Luck, and he's sitting here on the Texas side of the sidelines, maybe that's the surprise we need. But it's also possible that Quinn Ewers throws 4 interceptions, and he still ends up a great college quarterback. You can't expect that in his, second or third game of the season.
No doubt, against the Nick Saban defense that typically eats young quarterbacks alive. Now, there are exceptions, but usually those young quarterbacks, as you mentioned, are super elite. The Johnny Manziels, Cam Newtons of the world, that have success against Nick Saban. For a while there, you basically had to be like a Heisman Trophy caliber quarterback to be able to have a chance to beat a Nick Saban defense.
Okay, let's go back to politics. So you said something earlier, which I found pretty fascinating we were talking about COVID, and you thought it ought to be the number one voting issue for every American, red or blue. There's an interesting thing happening right now when it comes to the midterm elections in November. What looked like an absolute red tidal wave, according to most polling averages and some respected polling outfits, it has tightened considerably. It has tightened to where Democrats now are pretty close to Republicans. And I wonder how you explain that, because I agree with you, and I wouldn't even limit it to COVID. You could talk about inflation. You could talk about crime. There's simply not an issue, really, that should be a winning issue for Democrats come the midterms. And yet, here we see it tightening. Why?
I think gas prices coming back from $5 to $3.75-ish, depending on where you are in the country, has benefited Biden. I think that there is a suburban woman discomfort with the fallout of Dobbs and a fundamental misunderstanding about what exactly Roe v. Wade being overturned means. And I think that's a difficult conversation for many people to have. And so I think you well know fear motivates people. And so I think there's a little bit of a Dobbs impact. And then I think things are so bad. I think that Biden might well have hit absolute bottom in June, and there's about 40% of the American population that is going to support Joe Biden no matter what. And there's about 40% of the population that's going to hate Joe Biden no matter what. And I think the moving in that 20% that is persuadable has really kind of started to solidify. Now, I also think a lot of people are super busy. It's the summer. It's August. People are out getting their kids started back to school. They are running around and taking care of all the responsibilities that being a normal human requires. And I think post-Labor Day, as fall and campaign season really kicks back into earnest, I think that we are going to see, I said this back in January, I think the Republicans pick up 25 House seats, and I said in January that I thought they were going to pick up 3 Senate seats. The Senate might be optimistic. I still feel really good about the House. I think things will move back into Republicans' direction. I think Mar-a-Lago and the raid has distracted a lot. I think it's been fantastic for Biden because Trump becomes the conversation. And there are a lot of people that consider Trump to be the great Satan. And so it takes Biden off the table and puts Trump on. But I think Mar-a-Lago's basically played out. And so I think the trend lines are going to turn back to the border. I think it's going to turn back to the economy. I think it's going to turn back to crime. And I think those are bad battlefields for Democrats.
So I was going to ask you about that. So there is a school of thought out there that the conversation has been centered around Donald Trump, and that plays to Democrats' advantages. They're not talking about inflation. They're not talking about gas prices. They're not talking about crime. They're talking about Donald Trump. And I bet that when Joe Biden gives his address later this week, it will focus on MAGA and Donald Trump. So you buy into that. You buy into that analysis. The more the conversation is centered around Donald Trump and not Joe Biden, the better for Democrats.
Yes. Joe Biden didn't win the election. Donald Trump lost it. I really believe that. Biden is an accidental president, right? And so I think to the extent that Joe Biden can say, oh, look over there is the great Satan, I think it distracts from the fact that he's been incompetent and the worst president, frankly, of your and mine for sure, Will's life. I mean, I think he's way worse than Jimmy Carter was. And and I think if you look at him on the merits, what he has done as president, he's been a colossal failure. So if you are a colossal failure, the best thing you can do is not try to run on your record. It's point to somebody else who you consider to be a bigger threat and a bigger failure. And I think that's what Joe Biden and the midterm strategy is going to be. They're going to try to make it as if Donald Trump is on the ballot, even though he is not.
All right. I want to hit two more issues with you before I turn you loose to go to a middle school football game tonight. This one is the perfect story to talk with Clay Travis. The Buffalo Bills have released their punter, known as the punt god. He is so good, he is known as the punt god. They have released him because there's a sexual assault allegation when he was a student at San Diego State that has now made it into the news. Meanwhile, Deshaun Watson, as you pointed out on your social media feed, has 30 sexual assault allegations, harassment/assault allegations against him, and he remains on the roster of the Cleveland Browns. It would be easy to say the answer is quarterback versus punter. Is that the answer?
I think it's mostly the answer. I mean, my argument in general is that anything in the NFL other than do you make this team more likely to win is probably not the story, right? I think that NFL owners and their executives are generally amoral. All they care about is winning. I think Al Davis was right. Just win, baby. I think that fans, by and large, are also that way. Everybody remembers the Ray Rice video, but the Baltimore Raven fans cheered Ray Rice after it was acknowledged that he had done this to his fiance, right? This is what I've experienced living in the South forever, which is why the politics angle on things I'm totally ready for. If your side does it, and I'm not talking about politics, but it applies here too. If your side pays players and you get caught red-handed, the first thing you say is, they do it too. If the other rival gets caught paying players, you're like, oh, of course, they're dirty cheaters. You can't trust anything. I used to say on my radio show, sports radio show, if you want to examine bias in American life, whatever your favorite team is, pretend that your hated rival did whatever it was. If your quarterback got a DUI, what would you say? I remember there was a great letter to the editor. I don't remember which quarterback it was. I think it was J.T. Barrett in Ohio State. And if it wasn't J.T. Barrett, I apologize to J.T. Barrett. It was Ohio State, Michigan. One of the quarterbacks for Ohio State got a DUI. And somebody wrote into the local Columbus newspaper and said, I don't know why they set up DUI checkpoints there. This is totally unnecessary. There was no reason to be stopping this guy in his car. This is shameful, right? Ohio State Buckeye fan. If Michigan's quarterback had gotten arrested for a DUI, the same guy would have been like, this is inexcusable. There's no telling how many lives that guy put at stake. I said, whatever you will say to defend your favorite team, you're a Dallas Cowboy fan, Will. Like Zeke Elliott. Let's use Zeke Elliott as an example. What people said about Ezekiel Elliott, if he had been on a rival team, it would have been the exact opposite. I said that's what bias is. So what I think is important is bias is real. Think about your most hated rival if they did this, how would you respond? And so, like it's easy to go to punter versus quarterback, but ultimately all it's about is who wins. So if this guy had been Josh Allen had these accusations, there's no way in hell that the Buffalo Bills would have released him and said, we don't stand for this. Remember, it's a civil allegation. So far, it hasn't been a criminal allegation. And if there had been a guy on the Cleveland Browns who got accused of 30 different sexual assaults and he was the safety or he was a guard on the offensive line, that dude is gone. As long as your talent exceeds your problems, you will always be employed in sports and most of life in America today. That sums it up. And that's why I get so frustrated when people say, the NFL doesn't treat black quarterbacks fairly. Man, if they will win, they will do whatever it takes to keep a quarterback of any race employed on their team. That just win, baby. Al Davis got it right.
Yeah, and sadly, look, I share your opinion on bias. I talk about that when it comes to media coverage. The best thing you can do about bias is be honest about your bias. I think objectivity is an aspiration, not a status. So just be honest with the audience about where you're coming from and what you may hold in terms of bias. But I will say, and I'm not trying to play holier than thou, people think I'm biased and I'm a homer when it comes to the Cowboys or Dak Prescott or the Longhorns, whatever it may be. And maybe I am. But certainly when it came to the serious issues, I tried to be principled. And that, and many people, Clay, I think, extended that same type of bias and teamism beyond Republican Democrat, beyond Cowboys, Eagles, into race, into black and white. And then that put me in a position, Clay, where often I defended, I don't remember if Ray Rice was before I joined ESPN, but I know, for example, Greg Hardy, and he was a Cowboy, so people would say, well, you defend him because he was a Cowboy. I almost always defended the principle of innocence until proven guilty. Almost always. Deshaun, the only reason I caveat almost is because, and you've been on this side of this one, there's so much smoke around Deshaun Watson that 30 is like, that's a lot of innocent until proven guilty. That's a lot. But still, I tried to be real. I tried to be consistent on that principle. And for those that aren't consistent, and only see things through the prism of team, they found it easy at times to go, oh, well, you're a racist or you're a homer.
I fundamentally reject the idea that the NFL should be investigating players for things that have nothing to do with, like, if you want to investigate Tom Brady for inflated footballs, like that happens on the field, right? If you want to investigate somebody because they may or may not have used performance-enhancing drugs, that directly impacts the performance on the field. The idea that the NFL should be out investigating Ezekiel Elliott to see whether he was engaged in domestic assault or whether Ben Roethlisberger sexually assaulted somebody years ago, or frankly, whether Deshaun Watson did, to me is wrong, right? The criminal system and or the civil justice system can investigate these things. If a team decides that a player has done something that they consider to be unworthy of being employable anymore, I'm totally fine with that. That's how the world works. But look, Deshaun Watson was accused of sexual assault by 30 different women, and he signed the largest contract in the history of football. All right? That should end forever the argument that the NFL is biased against anybody who is black at the quarterback position. Jameis Winston went number 1 overall with the sexual assault allegation hanging out there. If you are super talented at the quarterback position, they will pay you as much money as you could possibly take under the salary cap, and they will defend you to the ends of the earth, which is why I always said about Colin Kaepernick, look, Aaron Rodgers could have taken a knee because he thought ISIS was being treated unfairly, and he still would have been the starting quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, right? If Colin Kaepernick had taken a knee and been as talented as Deshaun Watson is, people would have said, hey, you know what? I don't agree with him, but he's really good at quarterback. And that is ultimately what's going on here. If your problems exceed your talents, punters are relatively easy to find, and mediocre quarterbacks are relatively easy to find. I don't need those issues to deal with. That to me is the story of the NFL.
Yeah, and your example of Aaron Rodgers is perfect because I think they would have busted him out of the league on his vaccination status if he were a mediocre quarterback, black or white.
Look, if Baker
black
Mayfield,
or white.
Hey, if Baker Mayfield had come out and said, I refuse to get the COVID shot, I think they would have used that in Cleveland to be an excuse to get rid of him, right? But
I think so too.
It's totally true.
Yeah, and by the way, if it were a black quarterback, a mediocre black quarterback who did that, they would have done the same thing, and then we would have had a conversation about whether or not the league is racist, when all the league is really doing.
The NFL is actually aspirational in terms of what we should be hoping to reach when it comes to job performance, right? All that matters is basically how good are you? Almost nothing else matters, and to me, that is what a meritocracy should be about. Now, we can argue and discuss, hey, do you want your guy to be sterling off the field too? I think ideally. But ultimately, Al Davis got it right. Just win, baby. They'll do whatever it takes to win football games, regardless of what the backgrounds of guys might be or certainly what their identities are.
All right, let's end with this. Who will win, baby, in college football? It looks to me, with all due respect, Clay, to let's see, Clemson, Georgia, and Utah, that this is a two-team college football year. It doesn't seem like it's been this clear-cut to me in a long time. Alabama, as previously discussed, and Ohio State.
Yeah.
I don't see how we don't end up with that as your national championship game.
I think it can come down to seeding in some way, right? Because sometimes the two best teams aren't necessarily seeded 1 and 2, so they might have to play in the semifinal round as occurs. I go with Bama. I go with Ohio State. I think Georgia is going to be really good again. I think Georgia will find their way back in. And I actually think I'm not sold on Clemson and Dabo being able to bounce back as quickly, so I'm not sure somebody comes out of the ACC. I'm going to throw a little bit of a wild card in. You mentioned them earlier. I think Utah is the best team in the Pac-12.
So do I.
I like their schedule. They start with Florida. I like their chances to find a way to get a win there. Because I think in the first game of Billy Napier, that's a tough scenario. I think it's a low-scoring defensive game. Utah gets a win there. I think they are kind of the surprise team to advance to the playoff this year.
That's my same college football playoffs, man. It is, in my estimation, I don't believe, by the way, in Clemson's quarterback. So that's why they'll take too many dings along the way in the season. So, yeah, for me, it is Georgia, Utah, Ohio State, and Alabama in the college football playoffs.
Georgia, Alabama as a rematch again.
Oh, this is where Ohio State, and we'll see about their defense. This is where C.J. Stroud. This is where Ohio State, I think, is this. I think Alabama's your national champion. I think that revenge tour you talked about, combined with just how good Bryce Young is, and then everybody across that roster. I think Alabama's your national champion, but I think Ohio State meets them there. We'll see how seeding works out, but I think it's Ohio State, Alabama, with Alabama as your champion.
Two underdog teams out there. I think Tennessee's going to be pretty good this year, and I think Tennessee will win 9 games, and I think Arkansas is going to be pretty good this year. I think Arkansas, the Razorbacks, win at least 9 games as well. I know everybody focuses on Georgia and Alabama in the SEC, but I think both those teams are going to be pretty good.
Really quickly, what's the over-under on Tennessee's win total this season?
I think Tennessee goes 9-3. Loses to Georgia, loses to Alabama. The over-under, I think, is 7.5 on the
7.5?
Yeah.
I think that's the same as Texas. Texas could be 8.5, which I would take the under. I don't see 9 games for Texas. I was about to make a little side wager with you. We could care throughout the season. Who gets more wins, Tennessee or Texas?
Straight up, let's do it. Stake bet.
Okay, stake bet. Most wins this season, Tennessee versus Texas. Burnt orange.
Down in Florida again?
Yes.
All right, we'll have a decent sense by the time. That's late November. I think my balls will have already eliminated your Longhorns. I think I'll be able to cash in late November before the final end of the season.
I just want you to know,
the victory lap.
I'm not extremely confident in my side of this bet, but it always makes it more fun to wager. All right, Clay Travis, I'll see you at least in November. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Well, I'll see you at the Texas-Alabama game in like 10 days.
See you in Austin next weekend.
Yes.
That's right.
All right. See you then.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.